Welcome to Godsplaining, Contemplative Preachers, Contemporary Age. Each week, join the Dominican friars as they consider all things Catholic.
Hello, and welcome back to Godsplaining. I am Father Gregory Pine, joined here by the one, the only, Father Patrick Mary Briscoe. Father Patrick, how are things?
Dang, I thought I was on with Father Jacob Bertrand today. Must have been some screw up in the schedule. I'd rather talk to you. Can we get him on the phone here? I'd rather talk to him.
Yeah, exactly. It'll be like talking to me, except different.
Well, it is different talking to you today. The setting is different. I don't remember your room having a dormer like that. You know, like a kind of skylight
recently
looking thing.
Installed. Yeah, actually, so I'm in Austria at the Carthusian in Gaming, Austria, at the satellite campus. I don't know if you would describe it that way, but it's a place that is owned by the Franciscan University of Steubenville for their study abroad program. And I'm in like a roof room, but these dormers actually open. They don't open manually, they open mechanically. And I discovered that because I leaned against the button and then I heard this whirring noises. I got to get my, hold on. These whirring noises.
Das whirring noise?
Yeah, exactly. Dieses whirring noises.
Dine and whirring noise.
And then all of a sudden, you know, my room was just open to the elements, and there's only one season in Austria. It's the rainy season, and sometimes the rain comes in solid form, but that's basically it. So this was bad, but I figured out how to close it. So yes, the setting is different and very treacherous, but I'm faring decently. But that's an evasion, because I asked you how you are.
That's right. Yeah, thank you. I was just going to double down on the evasion tactic and say, is Gaming better than Freiburg, and why is it so?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's see. How would I make a relative comparison? So Freiburg's great because they speak French, which is a language that I know better than not at all.
C'est comme ça.
And Gaming is in Austria. Austria is in the German-speaking diaspora, he says, making up terminology. And as a result of which, yeah, I've had a couple of conversations with people that began and ended this way. Excuse me, let me just clear my throat here. Ich spreche kein Deutsch. And they're like, yes, another idiot American. Correct. I just want coffee, so please don't make fun of me as I depart.
No, they're like, it's been so long since we've had one of you because of the COVID.
Yeah, exactly. They kind of like grab you by both shoulders. I got one in the wild. Except I wouldn't be able to discern or verify whether they were saying that because it would come out not sounding like that. So yes, Gaming's a great place. I'm celebrating Mass and doing some sacraments and things for the English-speaking community here. So it's good. It's a beautiful place, and obviously it's nostalgic. Not obviously, but I was here as a student, and now I am still a student. So nothing has changed except the passing of time.
Oh, that's great. The exciting thing that's going on in my life is we've got our RCIA Mass. So Bishop Evans, the Auxiliary Bishop of Providence, is coming to campus, and we're going to baptize 3 students and help another 11 round out their sacraments. So that's great. So 14 people will receive the sacraments here at St. Dominic Chapel, which is great.
Boom.
In a lot of years,
That's
the program's been a lot bigger, but we've all been locked in our rooms, and it's been tough to meet people and stuff. So
yeah, exactly.
I'm trying not to be hard on that.
Tactics.
I talked a lot of trash to Father Bonaventure, who had these classes of 30 plus, and I was determined to do that during COVID, and the Lord said, "Nah, I'm going to give this one to Father Bonaventure. It's not your day, Father Patrick."
Yeah, I mean, okay, so faith is free, as it were, or it's something that one chooses by free will. So you can't force people to believe. Coerced faith is probably not a good thing. Certainly not a good thing. Okay, I should be serious about serious matters. But I wonder, if in COVID tide you could incentivize faith. No groups of over 5 except for RCIA, and people are like, sounding more attractive. It's sounding
Need
more attractive.
contact with other humans.
Human beings. Whew. Okay, so that's awesome. People receiving sacraments, grace being given. For this particular episode, we are picking up on our ongoing series of literature and fill in the blank. So in past, we've talked about Chesterton and C.S. Lewis. We've talked about David Foster Wallace and Cormac McCarthy. Here, we tread lightly. I suppose we tread somewhat, what's the word I'm looking for? What's the word that Father Gabriel Toretta would say? Terrifiedly? No, never mind. We tread somewhat cautiously on account of the fact that some of our listeners, almost certainly, will know a lot more about the subject than we do because it's a favorite of Catholics, namely the literature of J.R.R. Tolkien. So, Father Patrick, set us up, set the stage. When speaking or thinking about J.R.R. Tolkien, like what are the works that we're consulting? What is the thought world in which we enter? Where do we go from here? Where do we begin?
Right. I think the starting place with Tolkien is actually a kind of apology. We talk a lot about apologetics here on the podcast. It's an apology, a kind of defense for the project in general. I think you have to start there, right? Because some people, when they think of Tolkien, if they do at all, they think fantasy, therefore fairy tale, therefore not actually important. And Tolkien, as a serious scholar, a philologist, a scholar of words, their origins and meanings, Tolkien as a philologist has a deep understanding about what it means to create, what it means to make. And so for him, this world which he has created, and we'll talk a little bit more about what he thinks he does by creating, but this world that he makes is so elaborate and so complex and so very rich that its study is essential. So some people would say, isn't this just a kind of escape, a fanciful way to ignore COVID, to pretend that you can leave your 10 by 10 apartment for, 3 minutes and enter into a world of orcs and elves and dwarves and men, and that kind of escapism is not actually helpful to human life. This is not true, I don't think. I think that Tolkien is doing something very, very different, and that Tolkien's works help us not just to understand a world that he makes, which is tremendous in its own right. That's the argument I was making about the complexity of his creation, that it's tremendous in what he has achieved in creating it, but also because reflecting on this world helps us to better know and understand ourselves. So that, I think, is the first defense that I would make for why read literature and why read a fantasy story, why read something that comes from a section of Barnes & Noble, if people still go to stores that exist in brick and mortar, that comes from a section of Barnes & Noble that maybe we wouldn't ourselves wander through quite so readily.
Yeah, as you speak, I'm reminded of, I don't remember exactly where it comes from, but it crops up in movies and in literature. This idea that many, and I think oftentimes the dictum goes, that politicians lie to obscure the truth, and that writers, whether it be poets or novelists or whomever, they lie so as to tell the truth or reveal the truth. And I think that Tolkien is conscious of, well, the use of words, the meaning of words, the signification of words. He certainly wouldn't use the word lie because I think that he would describe his project more on the basis of like telling a deeper truth. And he's not there just kind of escaping into mystery language the way that popular apologists sometimes do. Somebody asks you a pressing question about how the sacraments work or the nature of God. Sometimes people just retreat and say, it's a mystery, which is code either for, I have no idea how to explain this, or yikes, I'm leaving. But what he says is, yeah, there's an intelligibility to this thing. And that theme that you brought up, this idea of escape, that it's not an escape from, but it's an escape into. It's the type of thing, it's the type of story that actually bears urgently, immediately upon human life because it shows us how it is lived, how it ought to be lived, not in like a morality type tropey way, but in the sense that it enriches or enlivens our humanity so that we can engage it, so that we can live it more profoundly. So maybe just to talk a little bit about genre, Tolkien has this famous essay on fairy stories. And there, he does a little bit of work just to distinguish, okay, what are we talking about when we talk about myth? What are we talking about when we talk about fantasy? What are we talking about when we talk about fairy stories? So maybe we could talk along those lines just a little bit. What do you think is most important for the listener? What do you think is most helpful for getting into the mindset?
Right. I love Tolkien's claim that mythology is not a disease. He says this very clearly. This is one of his things. That myth actually is a way of presenting deeper truths even. So for him, myth is not a lie. Myth is not a deceit. So some people will say, I can't read this kind of thing to my child because it's not real. It's not about the world. It's about something else. But for Tolkien, the myth, the fairy story, tells truths in such a deep and profound way that human beings can run to them, right? So in this project of myth telling or myth making for Tolkien is a kind of recovery. It's a sense of understanding us not just as we are, but as we were meant to be, which is a very different thing. As we are is sort of the project of the philosopher, but as we were meant to be opens up a different project, and there's a different premise there. So there's this idea that through myth, through storytelling, we recover the ideal. We recover something very deep about who we are. I think that's something really important to understand that Tolkien is doing when he's talking about myth and fairy story.
So again, as you speak, I'm thinking, all right, so we've rehearsed in past episodes before the difference between Tolkien and Lewis about the place of allegory. Right. So for those who've read the Chronicles of Narnia, you know that Lewis can be very allegorical, especially on account of the fact that these stories are geared towards children. And so in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the parallels between the life of Narnia and then the life of the Gospels is very close.
Right, the magic Jesus lion.
Exactly. He is terrible and good. Right, so with Tolkien, you don't have the same understanding of allegory. What you have is something that's more, I guess, historical and more conceptual. So maybe we could talk a little bit about, how do words work? How does history work in the worlds that he creates? Because I remember, the only time that I read The Lord of the Rings, I remember just getting completely lost in the appendices, which is a nerdy thing to say. But, you open that book, there's a preface there from Christopher Tolkien. He says the main complaint that's leveled against The Lord of the Rings is it's too short. And then you're like, wait, I'm holding like 1,000-page book right now. This is cheeky nonsense. And then you start reading it and you're like, I need more. I want more. I can't help but have more. And then you're just lost in the appendix and you're like, yeah, but what about the first age of Middle Earth? And tell me more about, yada, yada, and thus and such. So okay, he's got this art, this act, which he calls subcreation. As a fantasticist, to make up a noun, or as a myth maker, as one who is in the habit of composing fairy stories. But he does it in a very humane way, right? So he's got these elements of word and of history. So what's at stake there? What's going on?
So for Tolkien, the imagination is a human faculty, and it has to be engaged. And this is perhaps one of the principal reasons we might argue that for Tolkien there's not a great divorce. Lewis pun. There's not a great divorce between the imagination and the real world. And this is the argument that people who dismiss fantasy literature make. They say, "Oh, this has no bearing." But for Tolkien, the imagination, as one of man's highest faculties, and having been received for Tolkien as a good Catholic, believing this faculty to have been given us by God, for Tolkien, the imagination allows us this imitation of God as creator that is such an incredible thing, and so approximates the work of God that it can only be called for him subcreation. So subcreation, this work of making according to the imagination, is actually an imitation of God's great work. And for this reason, God's greatest work of creation. We could say redemption, right? Even better than what he first made. All right, I'll get to that before Father Gregory pounces on me. But this idea of subcreation then is an imitation of the work that God has done, and it is for that reason so very rich.
And I think so when I think of creation, I think of bewildering variety. He stumbles over the first, plosive syllable. Bewildering variety. There's so much to it, and it's almost as if God is showing off. Obviously, God doesn't show off, but we can only take in so much within the limitations of our understanding, within the limitations of our earthly life. You think about the fact, Father Nicanor Austriaco makes this point when he describes evolution. He says God doesn't only fill the created universe in this one time. He fills it throughout all of time. So you see his creativity as this kind of ongoing phenomenon, which is just so diverse that it boggles the mind. And you get that impression too with Tolkien because, okay, so people write stories in all different kinds of ways. The way that C.S. Lewis described Narnia is he had an image in his mind of a faun holding an umbrella underneath a lamppost, and from there began the Chronicles of Narnia. So for him, it started with a character. Some people start with a plot. Some people start with a theme. Certainly Chesterton starts with themes and then puts those themes on human-like stilts and then just trots them through. But with Tolkien, it's like he lives there, right? He is a creator by nature, by bent, by disposition. And there's so much more under the surface than you have expressed. You know, for every, dwarvish rune that actually makes it to the page of The Lord of the Rings, he's got like tens and scores and, he's got lots more where they came from, but he doesn't express them all.
It's kind of a discovery. And, the whole project, as listeners may or may not know, the whole project of The Lord of the Rings was to create a kind of pre-mythic history of England. It's the world that Tolkien knows and loves, and it's a kind of pre-Christian reading of what this thing is. And it's heavily impacted by the experience of his life, as having fought in the Great War, his understanding of friendship, the great friendship he had with C.S. Lewis, his love for his beloved wife and his family, his concerns about the alienation of these goods, of religion and family life caused by the rise of industrialization and so on and so forth, right? So you have all this kind of cast into this novel and then set back aeons and aeons, before the modern world. So in that sense, it's a kind of discovery of things, right? And again, just to drive home this point for Tolkien. It relies on reason. And for this sense, we can use scientific language like discovery to talk about his mode of creating, because it is again this human faculty, this gift which Tolkien engages that he thinks allows him to do this. So Tolkien looks to someone like Lewis Carroll that makes all these nonsensical jokes in his writing and says, well, he can only do that because of logic, because of reason. And so similarly, this is who I am as a creator, as an author.
Okay, so we're set up well for maybe exploring a couple of those themes, a couple of our favorite themes. But before we do that, let's take a quick break, and then we'll catch you on the other side of it.
You are listening to Godsplaining. Visit us at godsplaining.org to listen to our episodes, shop our store, and donate to our podcast. All gifts go to improving the podcast and bringing the gospel to more listeners. Thanks for your support.
So here we are, back on Godsplaining. We haven't gone anywhere because why would we? There's no reason to. But we've been talking in general terms about J.R.R. Tolkien, his thought world, his creative disposition when it comes to writing these stories that we are so delighted to have in hand. But Father Patrick, at the end of that first half, you described some of these themes that come up throughout The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or The Silmarillion. Maybe we could pick out one or two or three faves and just give some impressions on things of J.R.R. Tolkien's peculiar insight. So where do you think we should start?
Yeah, that's great. I'd like to dive into create. Here I'm going to be bold and say we can talk about all these things. So I'm going to announce them, and then we have to do it, Father Gregory. So you ready? I want to talk about creation. I want to talk about evil and doom, and I want to talk about the fight for the good, the response to evil. And I think these are three of the greatest themes of Tolkien, and this is one of the reasons why I think The Lord of the Rings is one of, if not the very greatest story of all time. So first with creation, right? Tolkien, any reader, anyone that opens Tolkien is transported so easily into another world because of the love he has for all of its creatures, for his landscapes, for his, to use the language of Catholic social teaching, his preferential option for nature. It's so remarkable. He just fills this universe, this world, with majestic scenes, with rivers and valleys and hills and mountains, and plains, and the contrast of all these different parts allows one to see something that is just as vibrant as what God first made. So in the age of the Laudato Si Church, right? I think it's easy for us to move from our love of nature to Tolkien's love of nature, right? I think it's totally compatible with something, our attentive care for creation that is just in the atmosphere right now. It's something we're talking about considering as a church, and so I think that Tolkien's presentation of the world as something that has to be cared for, has to be loved, is just immediately convertible into our sense of stewardship and delight, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, where's my mind wander? So I think back to the Silmarillion and the beginning of the Silmarillion, how, I guess it's Christopher edited it after his father's death, where he had these, substantial fragments that had never been incorporated into a complete work. And then he put them in something like an order and then sent them out. But the beginning is the Valaquinta, the story of the creation of, Tolkien's world. And there, right, so you describe the beauty, his insight into nature, and then the love that he exhibits for it. But the fact that all of this is underwritten by purpose, but a purpose that is beautiful. So a kind of beautiful purposivity underwrites nature, because he has it expressed, not unlike the way that Lewis expresses it in The Magician's Nephew, as the fruit of a song. And that song, by these kind of elemental spirits, again, somewhat like the Eldilla of Lewis's space trilogy. He has these elemental spirits kind of sing creation into being, with this note of conservation, suggesting that the very existence of those things depends upon the sustenance of the song. And even as a discordant note is introduced by that fell spirit, who is that, Morgoth, I guess? Like the elemental spirits are able to reorchestrate their song so as to incorporate it, which is a very beautiful way by which to account for the presence of evil while maintaining this affirmation that creation is good, and that creation is good in a way that's inventive, that's ongoingly creative, in a way that cannot be overcome by evil, but only ever permits evil so that it can draw it into something that's more rich, that's more textured, that's more delightful, in fact. So yeah, this idea that, you have these observations about the beauty of creation, and it's underwritten by this kind of creative purposivity, which, that comes out in a variety of spots in his works. I don't know if you have a favorite.
Yeah, I think one place to see this right is with the objective best character in The Lord of the Rings, which is Tom Bombadil. No one is allowed to say otherwise. This is the official opinion of Godsplaining. The best character of Tolkien is Tom Bombadil. And some of you don't know who Tom Bombadil is because Peter Jackson is a terrible person and edited him out of the movie trilogy. So you've never heard of Tom Bombadil. But I shouldn't be making moral judgments about Peter Jackson's soul. But I think it was a terrible artistic decision to exclude this wonderful character, because Tom Bombadil is the perfect foil for Sauron, for evil. Whereas Sauron wants to be the Dark Lord and have dominion over things, Tom Bombadil calls himself the Master, and he's the steward of creation. Sauron wants to use the ring to control others, and Tom Bombadil doesn't even see it. He just looks right through it. It has no effect on him at all. And this is more than just a contrast of good and evil. It's a showing of an approach to life and to creation. But Bombadil just lives to care for the old forest. There's no agenda. There's no plan, and that this is what it means to allow things to thrive in freedom. And so for these and many reasons, Bombadil gives us a sense of what God is like and how His providence operates. But I think Bombadil, his house in the middle of the forest is a refuge. He offers hospitality to travelers in a ready way and cares for them. The image of rain and sustenance there in the place. For these and many reasons, Bombadil really is the peak of Tolkien's creative work.
Maybe Peter Jackson purposefully omitted Tom Bombadil in a spirit of apophaticism, so he didn't want to image the unimageable God, or he realized as a kind of sign of artistic modesty that, given what he did with Faramir, that he couldn't bear to ruin another character.
Peter Jackson redeemed. All right. Good. I like it.
Okay. So to speak of Tom Bombadil as one innocent of evil and therefore, untempted as it were, or playful in a way that's like cosmically raucous, let's transition then more into this conversation about evil and say. So evil asserts itself very violently, very terribly throughout the course of The Lord of the Rings and in a special way. It's just like, oh gosh, as you get closer to, Mordor, as you pass through Mordor, you just feel it as a weight. And even Tolkien's prose reflect that. They get, what's the word I'm looking for? More lugubrious. They get thicker. They get plottinger. I'm just making stuff up at this point. But he makes you struggle as the characters themselves struggle through the weight, the burden of evil. So what are some ways in which Tolkien is not necessarily teaching us about evil, but portraying evil in a way that touches our humanity?
Yeah, that's right. I think one of the fundamental things that Tolkien manages to capture is the sense of impending doom that evil can cause, right? And that's part of the reason why the COVID-19 crisis has been so terrible, because in many experiences of life, we're able to distance ourselves from evil and its effects, but there's no running from the pandemic. It has touched everyone's life. And even though we're talking with hope about vaccines and this kind of thing, we know that our world has been changed by it, and so we're asking questions like, "Will it ever end? What will come back?" And this is real. This is the sense of doom that Tolkien captures. So we have that in a kind of epic way. The darkness that Tolkien is able to portray is very real. It's not a fanciful thing. And one of the reasons why it's so real is that Tolkien understands that evil is ultimately self-consuming. And he portrays this very clearly in the character of Gollum, right, who becomes obsessed with the ring, with the One Ring. And he can't abide a life without it. And in the end, as listeners know, in the end, Gollum is the cause of his own destruction, trying to pursue the ring, and eventually tumbles himself in it, with it into Mount Doom, to the fires below. We're the cause of our own end in Christian life, right? Whether we go to heaven or to hell is purely our work, our collaboration with God's grace. If we don't attain to the kingdom, it's our fault, not God's, because we've allowed ourselves to be consumed and totally self-possessed, and we've made no room for God in our lives. And that's what the ring does. It just collapses Gollum's universe unto himself, and it's an undoing, a direct opposite to the work of creation that Tolkien has done, which is so outward, the kind of passing on to an expansive vision of life, whereas evil, again, is about domination and being consumed ultimately, by one's own self.
It's interesting too, like, we talk about dread or doom, as it were, or an impending sense of imminent
disaster.
Collapse.
Yeah.
No, it's fascinating how he's able to convey that with such power and with such force while maintaining a kind of hope. But I think here of a comment made by Chesterton with respect to progress. He says, at his time, and certainly, like in the time, right before the composition of this work, there was a lot of hope, but it was a false hope, a kind of hope in technological progress or a hope in the improving estate of man on earth, as it were. But when cut off from the true or genuine sources of hope, it sowed within itself, the seeds of its destruction. And so, Chesterton remarked, there's no intrinsic principle of evolution in mankind. There's only an intrinsic principle of devolution, which is original sin. The only thing that we can count on is for evil to multiply. And if we are to claim anything back from that devolution, it will be at the price of great struggle. Everything that we have, he says, has been saved from a wreck. And you get that. Tolkien conveys that with great power, with great force. But in a way that kind of breathes into your spirit or fills your sails with a true hope, because it accurately describes reality. Reality's terrible. It's awful. I mean, things out there are bad, but it's not unto death, right? Or it's not unto destruction, or it's not unto a whole or complete collapse. The only tragedy, Leon Bloy repeated apparently, is not to have become a saint. But that still remains possible while we yet have life within us and while God continues to offer us his grace. Speaking of which, grace is a great weapon in the fight against evil, and you said that we were going to end there as our last theme. So, what do you think Tolkien has to teach us about this battle?
Well, I think that for all that we've talked about the reality of darkness that Tolkien manages to capture, so too does he capture the ultimate defeat of evil. And so Tolkien creates a word for this, our listeners may know it, called Eucatastrophe. Eucatastrophe. And so he takes the word catastrophe and he adds from the Greek a prefix meaning good. So eucatastrophe. And it means that kind of final salvation when it looks like all is lost that brings ultimate joy and happiness. So as a Catholic Christian, for Tolkien, the ultimate eucatastrophe is the defeat of sin by the reconciling act of Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection on the cross. Okay, and Tolkien says that this is the greatest truth about the world, the greatest truth about humanity, the greatest truth of our relationship with God. And then he puts that into the fairy story and says, this is why the fairy story is so good. Because the myth captures and imitates this marvelous thing that God has done. So the Lord of the Rings is a eucatastrophe, that happy ending, that good catastrophe, that final consolation. And Tolkien does this actually in all of his stories. It happens in The Hobbit as well, for another example, when the eagles come, when it looks like Bilbo Baggins and the dwarves are lost, the eagles come and pick them up and save them from that fire in the last battle. But in The Lord of the Rings, the great eucatastrophe, the great final ending, is the destruction of the ring and the saving of the army at the gate of Mordor. So you have this like happy calamity. Okay, so despite the looming evil and the way the powers of darkness are set quarreling against each other, Tolkien provides all these wonderful weapons against it. So we see the great story of friendship, particularly amongst the members of the quest, right? When the fellowship is formed, and we see sadly some of those relationships not last. Boromir is the great example of that. But we see the strength of real friendship in the hobbits, in their faithfulness to each other, or in Gimli and Legolas. So friendship, and we talk about friendship a lot here on Godsplaining, and it's true, because this is the way to fight evil, to make good friends, to be friends with each other, and to stand in the phalanx, in the trench with your friends, warring. And so Tolkien understands that one of the greatest weapons against evil is the joy of friendship.
Yeah, and those friends, I think the thing that's so striking is that those friends are ordinary, right? Mm-hmm. And some of those friends fail in very significant ways. And you can think about the final efforts of Frodo and Sam. Sam, who proved somewhat unmerciful to Gollum, although it seems justified at the time, and then Frodo, whose final act is a kind of failure, but a failure that happens under the providence of God. And yet they're able to cover each other, as it were, in the mercy which friendship extends to the other, and then to kind of be borne on together. And it's a powerful thing that you don't go to God alone. That's not to say that you don't have to be a whole person, right? Each of them is encouraged to and learns to live in virtue throughout the course of the story, or kind of comes into possession of his or her full identity. Specific, that's like most true in the case of Aragorn. But that, together, by virtue of what kind of propels them or gives them impetus, and by the virtue at work in each, they're able to accomplish, they're able to succeed in modest and in grand ways both. So, yeah, I think that gives us a sense of the purposefulness of our own strivings, because, on the one hand, you don't really know the purposefulness until you see it in the full setting, as it were, or until you see it in the grand scheme of things. But you can also have a kind of sense of that along the way, provided that you have bread for the journey, whether it be a lembus or the Eucharist.
Nice. I see what you did there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, so final thoughts. Anything else as a kind of commendation or last word?
For those of you who are wondering, Franciscans are the wizard Radagast the Brown, Dominicans are Gandalf the White, and Jesuits are Sauron.
savage. Real savage. Okay.
We could just clear that up once and for all. Part of the work of this podcast is to clarify the important, pressing questions of life. And here we have rendered, as Magisteres, our definitive judgment.
Oh gosh. Wow. Okay. Such savagery with which to conclude. Here I am at the Franciscan University. I'm just gonna mildly distance
Radagast is
myself
great. Sled pulled by rabbits. Who doesn't want that? Everyone likes that.
All right. Well, listeners, thanks for listening to this episode. We ask that you would like it, that you would share it, that you would leave a comment, and that you would, maybe send it to a friend as a fourth week of Easter gift. Because everyone needs a fourth week of Easter gift. What would you do without a fourth week of Easter gift? Please do, check out Godsplaining.org and the resources that we have there. Thanks so much for your support of the podcast. Thanks so much for your prayers. Know that we are praying for you. One final announcement is there's still a couple of spots on the retreat that's to be held July 23rd through 25th for those between the ages of 21 and 33. Again, it's in Huntington, New York, and it'll look like a retreat. And the five of us will be present, as will Katie Parker, who does the tech stuff, so helping us to make it good, make it great. Let me get that right. So we look forward to seeing you there if you're able. If not, please do pray for us for that retreat. Pray for those who attend, that it might be spiritually fruitful and we can deepen the bonds of friendship that we form over the course of our weeks together. So we too go to God together, not unlike the characters that Tolkien portrays in beautiful fashion. So thanks so much, and we will catch you next time on Godsplaining.
Thanks for listening to Godsplaining, a work of the Dominican friars of the province of St. Joseph. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Leave a review on your podcast app, and visit us at godsplaining.org.